Anthony Jung was sitting in his modest office at Pine Valley High School, gazing at the framed photograph on the wall. An image of Steph Curry hoisting the NBA Finals MVP trophy from 2022. Next to the photo, a plaque bore the phrase that had become his personal mantra. Every young person deserves a chance to prove their worth. It was March 2025, exactly 20 years since the decision that would change not only the life of a young athlete, but also his own. The E2 decision that would haunt him, transform him, and eventually teach him the greatest lesson in humility of his entire lifetime. To understand how a high school assistant coach became one of the most respected voices about giving opportunities to underestimated young people, we need to go back to a cold November afternoon in 2005, when Anthony Jung was just an ambitious young coach who thought he knew how to recognize talent. It was the time of tryouts for the varsity team at a Charlotte Christian school. The gymnasium was filled with that frenetic energy that only exists when adolescent dreams are being tested against harsh reality. The smell of sweat mixed with the squeaking of sneakers against the polished floor created an atmosphere that was simultaneously hopeful and cruel. Anthony was standing beside Kevin O'Connor, the head coach, observing dozens of young men who were fighting for a spot on the team that could define their basketball futures. You could feel that every movement, every shot, every defensive play was being judged with the relentless precision of someone who had only 15 spots to offer. "Jang," said Kevin, discreetly pointing toward a skinny kid who barely looked 15 years old. "What do you think about that one?" Anthony followed the coach's gaze to Steph Curry, although at that moment he was just Del Curry's son, a scrawny freshman who seemed to have been swallowed by his practice uniform. The kid was shooting from the three-point line with almost perfect form. But have you ever judged someone by their first impression and then regretted it for the rest of your life? Anthony was about to live exactly that experience. "He's too small," said Anthony, making notes on his clipboard with the confidence of someone who had seen this before. 5 feet 11 inches, maybe 145 pounds. He's going to get destroyed against bigger teams. And look at his defense. He doesn't have the physique to keep up. Steph continued shooting, making shot after shot, with a naturalness that should have impressed any attentive observer. But Anthony was seeing only physical limitations, not infinite potential. "His father was NBA," commented Kevin, watching Steph make 3 more consecutive shots. "Genes don't guarantee anything," responded Anthony, a phrase that would echo in his mind for decades. "How many sons of former players have you seen fail? This kid will never have the necessary physique to compete at a high level." What's most striking is how we can be so wrong about someone when we focus only on what we see on the surface, completely ignoring what really matters: the heart. During the 3 days of tryouts, Steph Curry did everything a young person could do to impress. He shot with surgical precision. He showed court vision superior to most veterans. He demonstrated a work ethic that made other players seem lazy. But Anthony saw only a kid too small to survive high school basketball. On the night of the final decision, Anthony and Kevin met to finalize the roster. The list was almost complete when they reached the name that would change everything. "Steph Curry," said Kevin, looking at his notes. "No," responded Anthony without hesitation. "Too young, too small. Let him grow another year in JV. If he really has talent, it will show up eventually." Kevin looked at Anthony with an expression that, years later, Anthony would recognize as surprise and disappointment. "Are you sure?" The kid hit 86% of his three-point shots during the tests. Practice numbers don't mean anything against real defenses. said Anthony, sealing Steph's fate with the arrogance that only inexperience can produce. Trust me, he's not our type of player. And so, with a casual stroke of a pen on a clipboard, Anthony Zhang dismissed the person who would become the greatest shooter in basketball history. The next day, Steph discovered that his name wasn't on the varsity list. Anthony observed from a distance while the kid read the list once, then again, then a third time, as if expecting his name to appear magically. The expression on Steph's face at that moment would be etched in Anthony's memory forever. It wasn't anger. It wasn't despair. It was a silent determination that burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns. Steph turned and walked toward the practice court. No drama, no tears, just a resolution that Anthony should have recognized as the clearest sign of future greatness. Great things happen when extraordinary people transform rejection into fuel for excellence. But we don't always recognize that greatness when it's right in front of us. At that moment, Anthony Zhang believed he had made a routine coaching decision. He didn't know he had just given Steph Curry the greatest gift of his life, the motivation to prove that anyone who doubted him was completely wrong. And he definitely didn't know that 20 years later, he would be sitting in his office, looking at the photo of that kid who was too small, as a daily reminder that we should never, ever underestimate the power of a determined heart. The months that followed Anthony Zhang's decision were a lesson in humility that he still wasn't ready to learn. While Steph Curry dominated the junior varsity team with an ease that bordered on the supernatural, Anthony watched from afar, trying to convince himself that he had made the right decision. "The kid is on fire in JV," commented Kevin O'Connor, after the 10th consecutive game in which Steph had led the team in scoring, assists, and steals. He's averaging 28 points per game. Anthony looked through the office window toward the court where Steph was practicing alone, as he always did, 2 hours before the start of official practice. You could tell there was something different about that kid. A determination that transcended age, a dedication that transformed talent into healthy obsession. "JV is different from varsity," muttered Anthony, but his own voice sounded less convinced with each passing day. Have you ever tried to justify a decision that deep in your heart you knew was wrong? Anthony was living exactly that, watching Steph grow not just as a player, but as a natural leader who inspired teammates to exceed themselves. During the winter of 2006, something extraordinary began to happen. Universities started showing up at JV games, not to see the team, to see Steph Curry. Scouts who normally only attended varsity games were packing the bleachers to observe a freshman who was rewriting the rules about what was possible in high school basketball. "Zhang," said Amanda Foster, the new assistant coach who had been hired mid-season, "did you see Curry's numbers in JV? 62% on three-point shots? That's NBA statistics." Anthony felt something stir in his stomach. It wasn't just regret. It was the slow and painful recognition that he had made a chapotis mistake that could define his career. "He's still small," said Anthony, but the words came out automatically, like a defensive reflex against a truth that was becoming impossible to ignore. In the spring of 2006, Steph had grown 2 inches and gained 15 pounds of muscle. But more important than the physical changes were the changes in how he commanded the court. It was like watching a conductor directing a symphony. Every movement had purpose. Every decision was precise. The moment that changed everything for Anthony happened during the JV state semifinals. Steph scored 42 points, including 9 three-point shots, leading Charlotte Christian to a victory that seemed impossible against a team superior in all physical aspects. After the game, Anthony watched Steph being surrounded by dozens of college scouts. Coaches from Duke, North Carolina, Wake Forest, all wanting to talk to the kid Anthony had considered too small for high school. "My God," whispered Anthony to himself, feeling the weight of realization falling on him like an avalanche. "What have I done?" What's most striking is how sometimes we need to see our mistakes reflected in others' success to comprehend the magnitude of what we lost. That night, Anthony couldn't sleep. He lay awake, reliving every moment of the tryouts, every justification he had given for cutting Steph, every opportunity he had denied the kid to show his worth at the varsity level. The following year, Steph was finally promoted to varsity. Not because Anthony had changed his mind, but because Kevin O'Connor had made the decision alone. And then Anthony saw up close what he had missed. Steph transformed a mediocre team into a state championship contender. He led by example, inspired through determination, and played with a passion that was contagious to everyone around him. But what impressed Anthony most was how Steph treated everyone with respect. Even him, the coach who had doubted his potential. During a local interview after an important victory, a reporter asked Steph about his high school journey. "There were difficult moments," said Steph, with that maturity that went beyond his 17 years. "Being cut from varsity in freshman year hurt a lot. But I learned that we can't control other people's decisions. We can only control our response to those decisions." Anthony watched the interview from home, feeling every word like a lesson in grace and forgiveness that he didn't deserve. "That moment taught me that no one can tell you what your ceiling is, except yourself," continued Steph. "And sometimes the people who don't believe in you end up giving you the greatest gift possible: the motivation to prove they're wrong." That night, Anthony Jung cried for the first time since childhood. Not just for the mistake he had made, but for the nobility of character of a young man who had transformed rejection into fuel for greatness. When Steph graduated and went to Davidson College with a full scholarship, Anthony knew he was watching the departure of someone destined for greatness, but he had no idea he was observing the beginning of a journey that would make Steph Curry the greatest shooter in basketball history. Great things happen when we learn to transform our biggest mistakes into our most valuable lessons, but sometimes that learning takes a lifetime to happen. And for Anthony Jung, the real learning was just beginning. It was April 2015. Anthony Jung was on his couch, watching NBA playoff coverage, when his life changed again. This time in a way he could never have anticipated. Steph Curry had just led the Golden State Warriors to their first championship in 40 years, and was being interviewed on Good Morning America. "Steph," asked the host, "many young athletes face rejection early in their careers. Can you share some personal experience about that?" Anthony felt his stomach tighten. Something in the tone of the question and Steph's expression suggested that a very familiar story was about to be told to millions of people. "Well," said Steph, with that humble smile that had won over the country, "in my freshman year of high school, I was cut from the varsity team. The assistant coach said I was too small and would never have the necessary physique to compete at a high level." Anthony's blood turned to ice. He could feel that his professional life was about to be exposed on national television in a way he had never imagined. "That moment was devastating for a 15-year-old kid," continued Steph. "But it was also the greatest gift anyone could have given me, because it forced me to work twice as hard as any other player on the court." Anthony turned off the television and sat in the silence of his living room for several minutes. His phone started ringing almost immediately. First it was fellow coaches, then local journalists, then national media outlets. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you had involuntarily become part of a sports legend? Anthony was discovering that being the coach who cut Steph Curry was a label that would follow him for the rest of his life. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. Sports blogs began investigating who had been the coach responsible for the decision. It took only 48 hours for his name to appear in the first articles. Anthony Jang, the man who almost changed basketball history, was one of the EVT's headlines that hurt most. Not because it was malicious, but because it was tragically accurate. Kevin O'Connor, who is now athletic director at another school, called Anthony that week. "Zhang," he said, his voice carrying a compassion Anthony didn't expect. "Are you okay? I saw some of the online articles." "I don't know how I feel," admitted Anthony. "On one hand, it's humiliating to have your biggest professional failure exposed nationally. On the other, maybe it's exactly what I needed." What's most striking is how sometimes we need to face our mistakes publicly to finally begin the real process of personal growth. In the months that followed, Anthony received hundreds of emails and messages. Some were cruel, calling him incompetent and questioning his ability to recognize talent. But many others were from young athletes who had been rejected and found inspiration in Steph's story. "Mr. Jang," wrote a 16-year-old from Kansas, "I was cut from my school's team last year. Reading about how Steph Curry used his rejection as motivation gave me hope that I, too, can prove they were wrong about me." These messages forced Anthony to confront a truth he had avoided for years. His decision hadn't only affected Steph Curry. It had become part of a larger narrative about perseverance, determination, and never giving up on dreams. In September 2015, Anthony made a decision that would change the rest of his career. He wrote an open letter that was published on the Charlotte Observer website. "10 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my coaching career," the letter began. "I cut Steph Curry from the varsity team because I judged only what I could see physically, completely ignoring what really matters: the heart of a competitor. Today, watching Steph inspire millions of people around the world, I realize that my mistake wasn't just about basketball. It was about underestimating the power of human determination and the capacity for growth that exists in every young athlete." The letter continued. "I use this experience every day to remind other coaches that our job isn't just to develop players, it's to never destroy dreams. Every young person deserves the chance to prove their worth, even when we can't immediately see their potential." The response to the letter was overwhelmingly positive. Dozens of schools contacted Anthony for lectures about how to recognize and nurture hidden talents. Youth sports organizations began, inviting him for workshops about giving second chances. But the response that mattered most came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the letter's publication, Anthony received a phone call that would change his perspective forever. "Mr. Zhang, this is Steph Curry." Anthony felt his heart accelerate. "Steph, I wasn't expecting—" "I read your letter," said Steph, his voice carrying that same grace Anthony had witnessed years before. "I wanted to thank you for your honesty. And more importantly, I wanted you to know that I never hold a grudge about that decision." "Steph, Mr. Zhang," Steph interrupted gently, "that no you gave me was exactly the fuel I needed. You gave me the greatest gift possible, the motivation to never accept limitations that others try to place on us. Great things happen when we have the courage to admit our mistakes and transform them into opportunities for growth for ourselves and others." When Anthony hung up the phone, he was crying. But this time, they weren't tears of shame or regret. They were tears of someone who had discovered that even our biggest mistakes can be transformed into purpose when faced with honesty and humility. March 2025. Anthony Jang was at his desk at Pine Valley High School, watching through the window a skinny 15-year-old practicing shots alone on the outdoor court. It was 6:30 in the morning, and the young man had already been there for an hour, working on his fundamentals with the obsessive dedication that Anthony had learned to recognize and value. "That kid reminds me of someone," said Amanda Foster, entering the office with 2 coffees. She had become Anthony's assistant 2 years ago, and together they had created a revolutionary program at the school. Anthony smiled, taking the coffee. "Marcus has that special fire. He's been cut from 3 different schools for being too small." Sound familiar? In the 10 years since his redemptive conversation with Steph Curry, Anthony Jang had completely transformed not just his coaching philosophy, but his entire life mission. Pine Valley High School wasn't just his workplace. It was his laboratory for proving that every young person deserved a second, third, even fourth chance. Have you ever met someone who transformed their biggest failure into their greatest purpose? Anthony had become exactly that person, using his experience with Steph as the foundation for something much larger. "Mr. Jang," said Marcus Wilson, the kid from the court, entering the office after morning practice, "can you take a look at my highlight video? I'm trying to get scouts' attention for the state tournament." Anthony took the tablet and watched the clips. Marcus didn't have the impressive physique that many scouts looked for, but he had something much more valuable: a natural understanding of the game that couldn't be taught and a determination that burned like internal fire. "Marcus," said Anthony, returning the tablet, "you have something special. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. And if someone tells you you're not good enough, use that as fuel." It was impossible not to feel that Anthony was talking as much to his younger self as to Marcus. Every conversation he had with young athletes was an opportunity to fix the mistake he had made 20 years ago. Pine Valley had become known throughout the state as the school that gave chances to forgotten athletes. Anthony had created a program called Second Shot, which specifically recruited young people who had been dismissed from other schools for being considered too small, too slow, or not talented enough. The program had produced 17 athletes who received university scholarships in the last 5 years. Not because Anthony had lowered standards, but because he had learned to see beyond superficial limitations to find hidden potential. "Anthony," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the school principal, entering the office for their weekly meeting, "I received another email from a college coach asking about our development philosophy. They want to know how we get so many results with athletes others considered non-recruitable." Anthony laughed. "It's simple. We stopped judging young people by what they can't do and started focusing on what they can become." What's most striking is how a lesson learned through pain can transform into wisdom that changes the lives of hundreds of others. On his desk, Anthony kept a framed letter, not from Steph Curry, but from Tyler Johnson, one of the first beneficiaries of the Second Shot program. Tyler had been cut from 4 schools for being too short to play center. Anthony saw in him the determination and game intelligence that others had missed. Tyler now played at Duke University. "Mr. Jang," the letter said, "you gave me more than an opportunity to play basketball. You gave me the chance to believe in myself again. Thank you for seeing what others couldn't see." That afternoon, Anthony received a call that still occasionally surprised him. "Anthony? Steph Curry." Even after all these conversations over the years, Anthony still felt a mixture of gratitude and admiration whenever Steph called. "Steph, how are you?" "Good, But more importantly, how's the program there? I heard you have 3 more kids being recruited by the NCAA. Anthony smiled. Steph had become one of the biggest supporters of the Second Shot program, not just financially, but as a mentor for the young people Anthony identified with special potential. Actually, said Anthony, we have a kid here who reminds me a lot of you at 15. Small, determined, with a shot that defies physics. Send me his contact, said Steph immediately. I'd like to talk to him. And Anthony, thank you for continuing to give people the chances I almost didn't have. When Anthony hung up the phone, he looked again at the photo on the wall, not just of Steph with the eye trophy, but a more recent photo. Steph visiting Pine Valley, surrounded by dozens of young athletes who had found hope in the Second Shot program. Below the photo, the plaque that had become his daily mantra, every young person deserves a chance to prove their worth. At 7 o'clock in the evening, when the school was empty, Anthony walked to the court where Marcus was still practicing. The kid was doing the same drill that Steph had done 20 years ago. 3-point shots from different angles with the robotic precision of someone who had transformed practice into obsession. Marcus, said Anthony, do you know why I believe in you so much? The kid stopped shooting and looked at his coach. Because 20 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my career. I dismissed a kid I thought was too small to play basketball at a high level. That kid was named Steph Curry. Marcus's eyes widened. Really? Really. And that mistake taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Greatness doesn't have a specific size. It doesn't have a specific color. It doesn't have a specific origin. Greatness has only one characteristic: the refusal to give up when others say it's impossible. Great things happen when we transform our biggest regrets into our greatest source of wisdom, and then use that wisdom to change lives that are still being written. Anthony looked at Marcus, who had resumed his shooting with renewed intensity, and smiled. 20 years ago, he had missed the chance to support Steph Curry's journey. But now, every day, he had the opportunity to ensure that no other young dreamer would be dismissed before having the chance to prove that the skeptics were wrong. And that was a second chance he would never waste.